Hi, this is Mrs. Rhodes, and our tutorial today is over the medieval period that we're going to study, which ran from 1066 until 1485. Again, this information is from your textbook. In case you would prefer to read there, that's fine with me. The medieval period is often referred to as the Middle Ages. It began in 1066 when the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, defeated the Anglo-Saxons in the Battle of Hastings. And then William the King, the Norman king, introduced what's called feudalism. And this chart here sort of explains feudalism for us. At the time, land is what signified wealth. And so what they would do is the king would give some land and title to the nobles. And they would also make sure that certain land was used and gave charters and privileges to different towns. And then they provided soldiers to serve him. The nobles also provided soldiers to serve him. And such as it was, the nobles provided land and protection to the peasants who would serve him and sometimes act as soldiers, and also provide rent and money to use the land on which they were farming. And so these peasants were known as serfs, and they were on the lowest end of that scale. After the Norman line ended its reign, other monarchs carried England through the rest of the Middle Ages. Most of these kings were strong, interesting people living troubled and dangerous lives in their search for power. The first monarchs were known as the Plantagenet kings, and King Henry II was the first of these monarchs, and he fought to control the Roman Catholic Church in England, and that led to the murder of Thomas a Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's displayed there in the picture to your right. Henry's son, Richard I, was known as Richard the Lion-Hearted, and he is the model of the true knight. During his reign, he traveled the world, giving riches to the poor and also seeking holy relics. Richard's brother John succeeded Richard, and he was a weak and villainous leader. But in 1215, he was forced to sign what's called the Magna Carta, which is Latin, meaning Great Charter. And in that document, he agreed not to raise taxes without the consent of the barons. And so many see the Magna Carta as the beginning of a constitutional government in England. Next came some Lancaster kings who fought a lot of battles, some of which were the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses. They were followed by the Yorkist kings, who came next, and they were important, particularly Henry IV. Henry IV encouraged William Caxton, who's pictured over to the right, to set up a printing press with movable type. And these presses were capable of printing in large quantities, and quantities large enough to bring the printed word finally to the public, and that's what was so significant during his period. Other than that, the rest of Yorkist history is really dark. There was an uncle who took control over Edward V's reign. It was rumored that he actually had Edward V and Edward's younger brother murdered in order to gain power. So those struggles kind of were pretty common during the period. During the Middle Ages, knighthood flourished in England. Knights went on local quests, or they went across the sea to fight the French, or on long journeys to the Holy Land. They jousted in tournaments while fair ladies watched and waited. And chivalry was the ideal, not to be confused with idea, but the ideal or perfect example that all knights had to try to attain. They needed to be honorable, courteous, generous, brave, skillful in battle, respectful to women and to the weak. The romantic idea of chivalry actually affected a lot of literature at the time. And in fact, if you study it very closely, you'd see that, and if you remind me, I'll show you, that it actually mimics also the Boy Scout code that is still used today by the Boy Scouts and the way that they should behave toward other people. I think it's kind of interesting. The Roman Catholic Church was very powerful in England during the Middle Ages, and people from all walks of life practiced the faith and built their lives around the Church's teachings. Knights were willing to die, and they often joined into the Crusades. And the Crusades were military expeditions that were undertaken to recapture the city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. They took place between, it depends on where you look. In the text it says 1096 and 1270. If you look here, what I found online, 1095 to 1289, so I don't guess there's an actual absolute answer to that. But overall, you should know that the Crusades were not successful, and instead we just have this violent and bloody trail that was left behind these Christians on their way to the Holy Land. In England, the Normans built a lot of monasteries and abbeys that helped strengthen the church's physical presence. Latin was the language of the church, and therefore it was known to all of the educated people of England, and most of the literature that was printed, because the educated people would have been the ones to read, would have been written in the Latin language. Life was normal and happy for Englanders for much of the time, and idyllic for a while. But in 1348 and 49, the dreadful Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, killed 1/3 of the English population. And again, shows you here 30 to 50% of the population, so the numbers vary depending on where you look. England did still prosper, and guilds, which are a lot like the trade unions that we have today, developed, and they established an elaborate hierarchy. Herding became more important than farming, and the end of knighthood was mostly caused by the invention of gunpowder. Drama as public entertainment began in England during the medieval period in the form of miracle or mystery plays, and those were productions in which stories of the Bible and other ancient celebratory texts were enacted in order mainly to teach those people who could not read otherwise, especially not in the Latin. And pretty soon after that we have morality plays, and those were productions in which the actors played the roles of virtues and vices like patience and greed, meant to teach those lessons to the people who obviously couldn't read the stories otherwise. Tudor rule began in 1485, and at that point the medieval age is said to have ended. There are quite a few terms for you to know in this unit. I've actually written some of these down for you if you can pause this at all and somehow write them down. Otherwise, they are in the textbook. We have the folk ballad, an anonymous ballad composed by a simple and educated people and passed on through oral tradition. We're going to see examples of that. The quatrain, which is a 4-line poem or stanza. Verisimilitude is the achievement of a true-to-life quality in a work of fiction. We're going to see that when we read Chaucer. Also in Chaucer, we'll see both the direct characterization and indirect characterization we've studied already. That's used when the narrator either reveals a character's personality by explicitly, directly telling the reader what type of person a character is, or with indirect by using subtle clues about the character's personality through actions and speech, thoughts, appearances, etc. Imagery is the use of words that appeal to the senses. If you remember, you're painting a picture with your words when you use imagery. A couplet is a 2-line poem or stanza. Irony is the awareness of a contrast between the way things seem and the way they really are. Situational irony occurs when what appears likely to happen is not what actually happens. Verbal irony occurs when the words appear to mean one thing but really mean the opposite. And dramatic irony occurs when what appears to be true to a character is not what the audience knows is true. Then we have enjambment and caesura that you should know by now, but just in case, enjambment is that continuation of a complete thought or idea from one line of poetry into another, and caesura is a pronounced pause or full stop within a line of poetry. I just corrected that, and it just... There we go. Maybe that'll work.